You know how it is. You're scrolling, you find something you love, you add it to the cart, and you click buy. It feels almost effortless, right? Well, today, we're pulling back the curtain on our favorite online stores. Because behind that simple checkout button is a whole world of data, logistics, and people. And we're going to figure out how to measure what really matters in that world.
Just think about it for a second. That last thing you bought online, when you gave them your info, what were you really agreeing to? And what about the people who packed that box or wrote the code for the website? How are they being treated? These are big, kind of tough questions, and honestly, for a long time, we've basically been guessing.
But that's all starting to change. Say hello to our new decoder ring, the SASB standards for e-commerce. SASB stands for the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. You can just think of it as a rule book, one that's designed to bring some serious transparency to all this stuff. It creates a common language so companies can report on how they're actually doing.
So here's our game plan. First, we'll look at the transparency problem itself. Then, we're going to decode how these standards actually measure what a company does with your data and how it treats its people. And finally, we'll see why just putting a simple number on these things is, well, incredibly powerful.
Look, almost every company out there says they care about your privacy. They say they value their employees. But how can you and I tell the difference between a real commitment and just some really good marketing? Without a common yardstick, all we have are these vague promises. What we need are hard numbers.
All right, let's dive into those numbers. We're going to start with your data. E-commerce platforms collect a mind-boggling amount of information about all of us. The SASB standards give us some really specific metrics to see what they're doing with that digital footprint. This is where we stop listening to promises and start looking at performance.
Okay, first, we got to nail down this key term, secondary purpose. It sounds a little technical, but it's super simple. When you give a store your address, the primary purpose is obvious, right? They need it to ship your stuff. But a secondary purpose? That could be anything else. Maybe they sell your data to other companies, or use your browsing history to show you ads for things that have nothing to do with them. Basically, it's any use of your data that goes beyond what you thought you were signing up for.
And that brings us to our very first hard number. The standard asks companies to report just one thing: the total number of unique users whose information gets used for these secondary purposes. It's so simple, but it's incredibly revealing. Is that number 0? A million? Maybe 10 million? This one number tells you a whole lot about their business model.
Now, what about when that data isn't kept safe? The standard has a really specific definition for a data breach. And listen to this, it's not just about somebody stealing your data. A breach is any event that messes with the confidentiality, the integrity, or the availability of your information. So that could be a hacker, for sure, but it could also be a system crash that just makes your data completely inaccessible. It's a pretty high bar. And this is the really crucial part. Companies have to report on breaches in 3 specific ways. First, what was the total number of breaches they had? Second, of those, what percentage involved personal data? Our data. And third, what was the total number of users who were affected? This 3-part story gives you a much richer picture than just a single headline.
Okay, we've talked a lot about data. Let's switch gears and talk about the people behind the platform. Because an e-commerce company is really only as good as its employees, right? From the coders to the CEO. So the SASB standards give us a really clear scorecard for what they call human capital.
So the first metric here is employee engagement. This isn't just a vibe. It's a specific number that comes from surveys. It measures the percentage of employees who are actively engaged with their work. You see a high number? That probably means you've got a motivated, innovative team. You see a low number? Well, that could be a massive red flag that something's not right internally.
Next up, turnover. How many people are leaving the company? But just knowing the total number isn't enough. The standard makes companies split it into 2 buckets. Voluntary, that's people who choose to quit, and involuntary, meaning people who were laid off or let go. And this is so important, because a ton of people quitting might point to a toxic work environment, while a lot of layoffs could signal big financial trouble. They tell very different stories.
Diversity is another huge one, and for gender, the standard has this super clear table. Companies have to show us the numbers across 4 different levels: executive management, non-executive management, the all-important technical roles, and then everyone else. This is key because it stops a company from hiding a lack of women in leadership by just giving us a single, company-wide number that looks good.
And that same 4-level structure, it applies to other types of diversity too. Companies get to define the groups that are relevant to their region, like race or ethnicity, and then they have to report the data in the exact same format. This consistency lets us see not just who's getting hired, but who's actually moving up the ladder into management.
Now, this next metric is pretty fascinating. because it gets at just how global the tech world is. The standard asks for the percentage of technical employees who need a work visa to be there. Think about that. That one little number can tell us so much about a company's hiring strategy and how much it relies on talent from all over the world to keep its site running.
And that number doesn't just hang out there by itself. Companies also have to tell us about the risks that come with that reliance. Things like changes in immigration law. And not just that, they have to explain how they're planning to manage those risks. So it directly connects their hiring practices to their business stability.
So we've looked at a bunch of different metrics here: data privacy, employee turnover, diversity. But let's take a step back. Why does this all matter? What's the real power in turning all of these complex, kind of fuzzy issues into a standardized scorecard? Well, here's the bottom line. Standardization is everything. When every company uses the same definitions and the same report card, we can finally compare apples to apples. A vague promise like we're committed to diversity can suddenly be checked against the actual numbers in their management team. It's what transforms good intentions into performance that you can actually measure and hold them accountable for.
And that pretty much brings us to the end. You now have the toolkit. This is the scorecard that investors, analysts, and now you can use to look right past the slick marketing and measure what's really going on. So, my question for you is, now that you know the scorecard, which companies are you going to start looking at in a whole new light?